He thought he could humiliate a girl right in front of everyone. But when her father showed up, everything changed in seconds. Watch the story until the end, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun stretched long, golden lines across the parking lot of the suburban shopping plaza, its light glinting off car roofs and glass storefronts in warm, mellow hues. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those deceptively calm weekends where families wandered between boutiques and coffee shops as if the world beyond the plaza did not exist. The central fountain gurgled cheerfully, water bubbling up in small arcs before falling into the clear basin below. Children leaned over its edge with coins in hand, tossing wishes into the rippling surface. 17-year-old Lily Norris sat on the low stone wall that encircled the fountain. Her legs were folded neatly at the ankles, the hem of her pale summer skirt brushing her calves. She had her headphones in, music playing softly, and in one hand she held a smoothie sweating with condensation. To anyone watching, she seemed perfectly at ease, a picture of youthful solitude in a safe place. Yet inside she carried the kind of quiet discipline her father had instilled in her since childhood. Always stay aware, always trust your instincts. But for a few minutes, she let herself relax. She closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of coffee from the nearby cafe mixed with the sugary aroma of fresh pastries. The laughter of teenagers drifted across the plaza, and the chatter of couples echoed in the air. Everything seemed ordinary, safe, and unremarkable. Lily exhaled, thinking she might stay another half hour before walking home. At the far end of the lot, a police cruiser pulled in sharply, cutting diagonally across two parking spaces. The squeal of its tires caught a few glances, but most people quickly turned away. The car was black and white, its sides dulled by dust and scuffed by years of service. From inside, two men surveyed the plaza with the confidence of those who had worn their authority like armor for too long. The first officer, Raymond Hawk, was in his mid-40s. His mustache was thick but poorly kept, and his eyes had the tired sheen of a man who once cared about the job, but long ago had replaced duty with cynicism. Beside him sat Officer Denton, younger, wiry, eager to mirror every habit of his superior. Hawk had cultivated him like a shadow, and Denton absorbed every smirk, every crude joke, every abuse of power like it was a badge of honor. Hawk sipped his coffee and nudged Denton with his elbow. "Take a look at that one," he muttered, nodding toward the fountain. "All alone. Just asking for some supervision." Denton leaned forward, peering through the windshield, his lips curled into a grin. "Long legs, soft skirt. Looks like our afternoon just got interesting." They opened their doors in unison, the cruiser rocking slightly as their boots hit the pavement. Hawk adjusted his belt with exaggerated authority, his radio crackling softly at his shoulder. Denton slid his sunglasses down and scanned the crowd with a mock-serious expression, as though he were hunting for trouble. But trouble was not what they were looking for. They wanted amusement, control, and an easy target. Lily did not notice them at first. She had pulled out a small paperback from her tote bag and was thumbing through the pages, her earphones still in. The two men strode across the lot, their shadows falling long on the bricks as they approached the fountain. Hawk's voice carried a false cheerfulness when he called out, "Afternoon, miss. Everything all right here?" Startled, Lily glanced up, tugging one earbud out. She offered a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you." Denton tilted his head, pretending to scan the plaza. "All alone? Doesn't look very safe to me. A lot of bad people around." "This is a public place," Lily said quietly. "I'm just waiting." Hawk stepped a little closer, his boots scraping the brick. "Waiting for what? Or maybe for who?" Lily tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She didn't want to answer, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "For my dad." The men exchanged a quick glance, a silent agreement that the conversation wasn't about information, it was about pressure. Hawk leaned on the stone wall, close enough for her to feel his presence. "You know, there are rules about how people should dress in public places. I wonder if that skirt might be a little—" He let the sentence hang in the air, his eyes dropping pointedly. Lily stiffened. "Excuse me?" Denton chuckled under his breath. "Looks like it rides up a bit when you sit like that." Her cheeks flushed with anger. She grabbed her tote bag, preparing to leave. "I said I'm fine. Please step back. But Hawk extended a hand and, in one swift motion, pinched the hem of her skirt between his fingers. He tugged it upward, just enough to expose more of her thigh than she ever intended a stranger to see. Lily gasped and slapped his hand away. "What the hell are you doing?" People nearby turned their heads. A couple at a cafe table stopped mid-conversation. A man holding a shopping bag froze, yet no one moved to intervene. Some frowned disapprovingly, others looked uncertain, and a few simply stared, phones hovering in their pockets as if unsure whether to film. Denton smirked and raised both palms mockingly. "Relax, sweetheart. It was just a joke." Lily's breath came faster now, fury overtaking fear. "Stay away from me," she shouted, her voice trembling, but loud enough to carry across the plaza. She pulled out her phone, fumbling to unlock it with shaking fingers. She needed to call her father. Hawk smirked, brushing off her anger. "Come on, don't be so dramatic. We're just making sure everything's safe." But before Lily could press a single number, a new voice sliced through the air. "Lily!" It was deep, steady, and cold. The plaza seemed to pause as people turned toward the source of the sound. Standing just 10 steps away was a tall figure dressed in black. His arms were folded across his chest, his stance calm but unyielding. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a controlled fire. It was her father. Lily's phone slipped from her hands, clattering onto the stone ledge. She ran to him, her composure breaking as she buried her face against his chest. He caught her easily in one arm, lowering his head slightly. His voice softened only for her. "What happened?" she stammered, her words broken. "Dad, he lifted my skirt. He touched me." The fire in his eyes flared, though his voice remained even. "Go to the car." She hesitated for a moment, trembling, but then obeyed. She bent to scoop up her phone, clutching it tightly as she hurried away toward the edge of the plaza. The crowd parted for her, murmurs following in her wake. Hawk and Denton stood their ground, though Denton shifted uneasily. Hawk tried to laugh it off, raising his hands. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Chuck Norris's voice was steel. "You touched my daughter." "Now hold on," Hawk said quickly. "It was nothing like that. We were just—" "You think lifting a minor's skirt is a joke?" Hawk's mouth opened, but he never finished the excuse. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the plaza. The air seemed to vibrate with the tension, every pair of eyes fixed on the tall man in black, and the two officers who had crossed a line they never should have. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera was already raised, the red light blinking, capturing every second. And though no blow had yet been struck, the balance of power had already shifted. This quiet Saturday afternoon, which had begun with nothing more than music, coffee, and a girl by the fountain, was no longer ordinary. The shadows had arrived, and they were only growing darker. The plaza had gone still, as though everyone present was waiting to see how the moment would break. Chuck Norris stood motionless, his frame casting a long shadow across the bricks. His eyes locked on the two officers who only moments before had laughed at his daughter's distress. Hawk shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at his younger partner as if for some unspoken support. Denton smirked nervously, his bravado flickering but not yet gone. The silence was heavy, almost unbearable, and it pressed down on them all like the thick heat of an approaching storm. Hawk cleared his throat, attempting a chuckle that rang hollow in the air. "Come on now, let's not get carried away here. She misunderstood. We were just talking." But the crowd knew better. They had seen Hawk's hand, the way he had grabbed the hem of Lily's skirt and tugged it upward, exposing her against her will. They had heard the laughter. They had watched her recoil in horror. A few murmurs rippled through the bystanders, whispers that began to take shape as words. "He touched her. We saw it. She said no." Phones were lifted higher now. Several cameras pointed directly at the confrontation, their little red recording lights blinking like signals that this time, the story would not be buried. Chuck's voice was measured, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "You humiliated my daughter. You put your hands on her. You crossed a line that you will regret." Denton tried to laugh, though the sound cracked halfway through. "Look, old man, don't make this bigger than it is. She was sitting there showing off. You know how girls are. We just teased her a little. A joke. The words landed like poison. Lily, still near the car where she had retreated, froze as she heard them, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and shame, her fingers trembling as she held her phone against her chest. She wanted to scream at them, to tell everyone what had really happened, but her father's steady presence kept her from breaking down entirely. He was here now. He had seen enough. The plaza was no longer just a marketplace. It had become an arena. Hawk squared his shoulders, forcing a grin as if he could still reclaim the authority that was slipping through his fingers. You really want to make trouble with us? With the badge? He tapped his chest where the metal glinted in the sun. We can make your life very complicated. Chuck's expression didn't change. His arms remained folded, but the quiet intensity of his gaze sent a shiver even through some of the onlookers who were not the targets of it. You've already made it complicated, he said softly. You think the badge protects you from consequence? You're wrong. Hawk sneered, turning his head to spit on the ground. Then, in a move so brazen it silenced even Denton's half-hearted chuckles, Hawk stepped toward the direction of the car where Lily waited. His voice was sharp, meant for her ears as much as her father's. If she didn't want the attention, maybe she shouldn't wear skirts like that in public. Maybe she shouldn't sit there alone, inviting eyes. Lily flinched, her grip tightening on her phone. Humiliation washed over her like fire, burning her skin and sinking deep into her chest. Tears threatened her eyes, but she blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. Hawk's words were not just aimed at her clothing, her posture, or her presence. They were designed to strip away her dignity, to make her small. Denton added fuel to the fire. Yeah, he said, his grin widening as he tilted his head back toward Chuck. Maybe Daddy should teach her how to dress if he doesn't want men looking. Or maybe he likes the attention she gets. The smirk on his face was one of pure provocation, ugly and gleeful. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth. A man muttered an obscenity under his breath, unable to believe what he had just heard. Several phones zoomed in closer, capturing every twitch of Denton's smirk, every cruel syllable. Chuck's jaw tightened, his breathing slowed, each inhale steady, each exhale deliberate. Those who had studied martial arts would have recognized the calm before a strike, the centering of the body, the control of energy before release. But to most watching, it was simply terrifying, the stillness of a man who had decided that there would be no more words. Hawk, sensing the shift, but still clinging to his delusions of control, reached out with a sudden motion. His hand, rough and insistent, snatched at Lily's arm as she tried to step back toward the car. His fingers dug into her skin as he yanked her forward. She cried out, her phone falling onto the asphalt with a clatter that echoed far louder than its small size should have allowed. Hawk leaned close, his breath sour against her ear. What's the matter, sweetheart? Don't like jokes? That was the final fracture. Whatever thread of restraint Chuck had held onto in those long moments of humiliation and mockery snapped cleanly. The crowd saw it happen in his eyes, a subtle narrowing that transformed him from a father standing in defense to a warrior stepping into battle. He took a single step forward, closing the distance in less than a heartbeat. His hand clamped onto Hawk's wrist with an iron grip, forcing him to release Lily instantly. Hawk let out a startled grunt, trying to wrench free, but Chuck's hold was unbreakable. Let her go, Chuck said, though Hawk was already wincing in pain. Then with a twist of his body and a precision born of decades of discipline, Chuck drove Hawk backward, releasing his grip only to send his open palm into the officer's chest. Hawk stumbled, his balance shattered, his body colliding with the stone fountain wall. He staggered, clutching at his chest, his mustache stained with sweat as his bravado evaporated under the sheer force of the moment. Denton reacted with fury, shouting, "You can't touch an officer!" He lunged toward Chuck, hand reaching for the baton at his belt. Lily scrambled backward, heart pounding, as Denton drew the weapon and raised it high, his intent clear. But Chuck was faster. His hand snapped upward, seizing Denton's wrist mid-swing. With a swift twist, he forced the younger officer's arm backward, the tendons straining until a sickening crack echoed in the plaza. Denton howled, dropping the baton to the ground as he fell to his knees, clutching his shattered wrist. The crowd erupted, some gasping, others cheering, voices overlapping in a cacophony of outrage and awe. Phones were raised higher, documenting every frame. A woman shouted, "He was protecting her! We saw everything!" Another added, "They started it! They touched her first!" Hawk, blood now trickling from his nose after a second blow, Chuck delivered without hesitation, slumped against the fountain, dazed and groaning. Denton writhed on the ground, his pride as broken as his wrist. Chuck stood between them and his daughter, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He did not gloat, did not shout, did not revel in the domination. He simply existed as a wall of unyielding force, the embodiment of consequence finally brought down upon men who had believed themselves untouchable. Lily, shaking but no longer cowering, took a step closer to him. Her eyes were wide, her breath unsteady, but she felt the weight of his presence shielding her. For the first time since the officers had approached, she allowed herself to believe she was safe. Yet even as relief flickered in her chest, fear lingered. The sirens in the distance grew louder, a rising wail that signaled reinforcements were on the way. The plaza was no longer just a stage for humiliation. It was now the scene of a battle that would ripple far beyond these brick pathways. Chuck glanced at his daughter, then back at the broken men before him. His words were calm, yet they carried like thunder. "This isn't over." And as the blue and red lights reflected across the glass storefronts, the crowd realized that they were witnessing not just a skirmish, but the ignition of something much larger, something that would not be forgotten or erased. The wail of sirens swelled in the distance, a warning carried on the summer air that more uniforms were coming. The lights of the plaza seemed sharper now, colors almost brittle against the tension that filled every corner. Hawk groaned against the fountain wall, blood trickling down his mustache, his chest heaving as he struggled to sit upright. Denton clutched his ruined wrist, his face pale with agony, his earlier bravado dissolved into pained whimpers. The crowd pressed closer in a wide arc, dozens of phones recording, dozens of voices whispering and murmuring with the jittery energy of those who had seen something unforgettable. Chuck Norris stood as if he had been carved into stone, unmoved by the chaos around him. His eyes did not waver from the two men sprawled at his feet. His breathing was steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. Yet there was an unmistakable coil of power in the way he carried himself, like a storm contained within flesh and bone. He was not gloating, he was not smiling. He was simply present, and that presence commanded every gaze, every thought, every silence in the plaza. Lily had not taken her eyes off him since she had run to the safety of his shadow. She was pressed against the side of their car now, still trembling, still shaken, but steadier than before. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, his simple command. "Go to the car." Even in that moment of confusion and humiliation, she had obeyed, because his tone had not been one of suggestion, but of certainty. She looked at him now and realized that the certainty was still there, radiating outward like a shield that no one could pierce. The crowd's murmur shifted when the first of the reinforcements arrived. A second cruiser screeched into the lot, followed by two more, their lights flashing red and blue across the polished glass windows of the shops. Doors flew open and boots hit the ground, weapons already resting on holsters as the officers scanned the scene before them. To their eyes, it must have looked like madness. Two of their own, battered and broken, a tall man in black standing over them, and a crowd circling like a jury waiting to deliver its verdict. One of the younger officers, barely past 20, lifted his hand toward his sidearm. "Sir, step away from them," he shouted, his voice unsteady but loud enough to carry. "No!" a woman from the crowd yelled back. She was middle-aged, dressed in gym clothes, her face red with outrage. She thrust her phone into the air. "Don't you dare! He didn't start it! Those two pigs grabbed his daughter! We saw everything!" More voices joined hers. "He touched her skirt!" shouted another. "They laughed at her!" called a teenage boy holding his phone high. "It's on video! We have it all on video!" The words tumbled out from dozens of mouths at once, creating a wave that rolled toward the newly arrived officers, leaving them stunned and hesitant. The sergeant who had led the reinforcements stepped forward. A tall woman with sharp eyes that took in every detail. Her nameplate read, Reyes. She crouched beside Hawk, who was groaning with his face bloodied, and then glanced at Denton, still curled on the ground. Her lips tightened as she rose and turned toward Chuck. "What happened here?" she asked, her tone calm, but edged with steel. Chuck's gaze flicked to his daughter, then back to the sergeant. "They harassed my girl," he said, his voice low and controlled. "One of them put his hands on her. I reacted." Reyes studied him for a long moment, her brow furrowed, then shifted her eyes to the crowd. Dozens of phones were angled toward her, dozens of eyes burning with expectation. One young woman stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she held up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing," she said, "from the moment they walked up to her. You need to see this." Reyes accepted the phone and played the video. Silence fell as the footage scrolled across the screen, showing Hawk and Denton's mocking words. Hawk's hand tugging at the hem of Lily's skirt, the shock on her face, her cry of protest. The footage captured the moment Chuck arrived, his stillness, his warning, and then his explosive precision as he struck Hawk and disarmed Denton. It was undeniable. The sergeant's jaw clenched. She raised her hand when one of her officers moved toward Chuck with handcuffs. "No," she said sharply, "not yet." The young officer froze, confused, but stepped back under her glare. The plaza was alive with tension, but it was no longer directed at Chuck. The cameras had told the truth, and the truth was ugly. Hawk and Denton were not protectors of the community. They were predators who had been caught in the act. Lily emerged slowly from the car, her steps tentative, but when she stood beside her father, her voice was steadier than she thought it could be. "He said I was suspicious because I was alone. Then he joked about my skirt. Then he lifted it." Her face flushed as she spoke the words, but she didn't look away from Reyes. Chuck's voice was quieter now, but it carried the weight of finality. "And I did what any father would do." Reyes exhaled, her expression unreadable. "Understood," she said after a pause. "There's a process that has to be followed. Statements, reports. But off the record, what they did was across the line." She turned to her men. "Secure the scene. Collect statements. No more weapons drawn." The officers obeyed, though uneasily, their gazes darting between the crowd and the man who had dismantled two of their own in seconds. Chuck remained calm, his arms now at his sides, his stance unthreatening but unyielding. Lily stood close to him, her shoulders squared despite the tremor that still lingered in her body. As the plaza bustled with activity officers cordoning off the area, witnesses speaking in low, angry tones, cameras still recording, Chuck led his daughter toward the patrol car Sergeant Reyes indicated. Reporters were already arriving, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions. "Did you assault two officers? Was your daughter harassed? Will you press charges?" Neither of them answered. Chuck's silence was more powerful than any words could have been. By the time they were escorted into the station hours later, the story had already spread beyond the boundaries of Santa Clarita. Clips of the confrontation had gone viral, shared across platforms, dissected by strangers, inflaming debates that had been simmering for years. The image of Chuck Norris standing between his daughter and two humiliated officers became a symbol, though no one yet knew whether it would stand for justice or controversy. That evening, in the sterile glow of the station's fluorescent lights, Captain Darren Mooney walked into the interview room. His face was grim, the weight of bureaucracy heavy in his features. He looked at Chuck, then at Lily, before setting a folder on the table. "I've reviewed the footage," he said, his voice low. "What those officers did is unacceptable. But they're still ours. That means procedure, internal affairs. Technically, they're still protected by the badge." Chuck leaned forward slightly, his eyes like sharpened steel. "They laid their hands on my daughter. That's not procedure. That's not protection. That's assault." Mooney sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're right. But if we don't handle this carefully, it gets buried in court. I'll be recommending immediate suspension, but you need to understand this fight won't end here. They'll try to flip the narrative." Lily's voice cut through the room, quiet but sharp. "They touched me in public. In uniform, they laughed at me. How do you flip that?" Mooney paused, his eyes softening for the first time. I have daughters too, he admitted, and I promise you I won't let this get buried. It was a promise, but Chuck knew promises in rooms like these were fragile. He nodded once, then placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. She leaned into it, finding strength in his silence. When they finally left the station, the sky had darkened. The city's lights shimmered across the horizon, deceptive in their calm glow. But the stillness that had followed them from the plaza was not peace. It was only the eye of the storm, a pause before the next wave of battle. Chuck knew it. Lily felt it. The world was watching now, and the fight was only beginning. The night had not erased the images burned into the plaza hours earlier. They lived now in countless phones, countless screens. The flashes of violence and humiliation replayed with every click and share. By the time Chuck and Lily reached home, they knew the world had already taken sides. Though no one could yet predict how far the story would ripple. The footage was out there, unpolished and raw, spreading with the speed of outrage. Still in the quiet of their house, silence hung like a fragile shield. Lily wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch, her body rigid though she tried to appear calm. Chuck sat beside her without speaking. He offered her a cup of tea, but she only stared at it, her fingers too stiff to curl around the handle. Outside, the street seemed quiet, yet Chuck's instincts were awake and restless. He had lived long enough to know that when men of power are embarrassed, their next move is not retreat but escalation. His suspicion was confirmed just past midnight. He had risen to check the locks on the doors when he heard a faint buzz, mechanical and steady, above the house. He stepped outside into the cool darkness of the backyard, the wooden staff he had kept near the door in his hand. Above the trees, a red light blinked. A drone hovered, shifting as though it were watching, recording. Chuck narrowed his eyes. With one motion, he hurled the staff into the air. The wood spun end over end before striking the drone with a sharp crack. The machine shuddered, then fell, crashing into the grass with sparks flickering from its cracked casing. Chuck strode forward, crouched, and examined it. On its side was a sticker, KH Security. Not police, but private. He lifted the memory module carefully, slipping it into an anti-static bag he kept for electronics. This was no random curiosity. Someone had sent it. Inside, Lily stood in the doorway, her blanket clutched around her shoulders. Her voice was hushed with dread. "Are they watching us?" Chuck met her eyes. "Yes, but they won't get what they want." The next morning brought no calm. While Chuck contacted Ernesto Santiago, an old detective friend now working freelance investigations, Lily scrolled through her phone despite the ache it brought her. A viral tweet had already begun circulating. Hollywood actor assaults two cops. The clip was cropped to show only Chuck's fist connecting with Hawk's face. The words beneath it sneered at him as a washed-up fighter, a relic lashing out for attention. Thousands of comments followed, some defending him, others condemning him, and many twisting the truth into something grotesque. Lily slammed the phone face down on the table, her voice raw. "They're lying. Everyone is lying. They're making me feel like I did something wrong, like I invited this." Chuck looked up from the dismantled drone. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that came from decades of choosing stillness before striking. They distort because they're afraid. First impressions win online, but truth lasts longer. We'll hold the line. We don't feed the fire. We wait and we show what really happened. Lily shook her head. "It feels like we're getting punched again and again, and all we do is stand here." He studied her carefully, then said, "Restraint isn't weakness, it's strategy." That evening, candles began to appear outside their house. Neighbors, activists, strangers who had seen the videos arrived, holding signs painted with phrases that echoed through the night. "Justice for Lily. Protect our daughters. No more abuse." Their voices carried softly but firmly, a chorus of solidarity. Lily watched from her window, her breath catching as she saw children holding their parents' hands. Families standing together, flames flickering in the summer night. For the first time since that afternoon at the fountain, she felt something stir beyond anger. She opened her journal and began to write, not about humiliation or fear, but about the woman who held a sign, the man who refused to put down his camera, the child who clutched his mother's hand as they lit a candle together. It was not just her fight anymore. The phone rang later that night, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. Chuck answered, his hand steady on the receiver. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then a distorted voice spoke, mechanical and chilling. "The next video will show who you really are." Chuck didn't hang up. His voice was flat, unyielding. "Every second of this is evidence. Every drone, every whisper, every threat. You're not silencing anyone. You're building a case." The line went dead. Chuck lowered the receiver, his jaw set. Lily stood in the hallway, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. "I don't want this to become endless. I just wanted it to stop that day." He stepped closer, his presence solid and grounding. "It's not endless," he said, "because this time, we choose the ending." The following morning, news broke across every local broadcast. Officers Raymond Hawk and Thomas Denton suspended without pay. An internal affairs investigation opened for inappropriate conduct and possible assault of a minor. The announcement was bureaucratic, clinical in its language, but the impact was undeniable. For Lily, it was the first crack in the wall of power that had loomed over her. She read the words over and over, the tension in her chest loosening ever so slightly. Chuck only nodded when he heard. He knew it was not victory yet. It was only the door creaking open. The pressure mounted as an investigative journalist named Lena Price released the unedited video. It showed everything. The approach, the mocking words, Hawk's hand on Lily's skirt, her cry, and Chuck's arrival. No cuts, no distortions, just truth. The video went viral again, but this time as a weapon of clarity. Commentators who had called it staged now fell silent. Communities far beyond Santa Clarita took notice. Meanwhile, Ernesto arrived at their home with the decrypted footage from the fallen drone. What they saw chilled them. Night vision passes over their house, zooms on Lily's bedroom window, timed observations of their routine. It was not surveillance, it was stalking. "That's a federal privacy violation," Ernesto said grimly. "And with what I've already pulled from KH's employees, they'll break quickly if we push." Chuck nodded once. "Do it." The next day, federal authorities raided KH Security's office. Hard drives, contract logs, and private communications were seized. The operations manager, Mark Albertson, had already vanished, but the lower-level employees folded fast, revealing orders given in writing. Gathered discrediting material on Chuck Norris and his daughter. Do not engage. Record only. The plan had failed. Instead of burying her, the attempt had exposed a network of shadows. That afternoon, Lily returned alone to the plaza. The fountain gurgled as it had before, sunlight catching on its ripples. She sat where she had been humiliated. No music in her ears this time, only stillness. A woman approached, hesitant. She was in her 40s, her face lined with weariness. "Are you Lily?" Lily nodded slowly. The woman smiled faintly. "I wanted to thank you. My daughter. She never told me about what happened to her last year. A cop said things to her during a stop. She stayed silent. But after your story, she came forward. We reported it." Lily's throat tightened, her eyes welling despite her resolve. The woman placed a hand gently on her arm. "What you did mattered." For the first time, Lily smiled through her tears. She understood then that this was not only her battle, it was larger, heavier, but also brighter, because it carried others with it. That evening, she and Chuck sat on the porch under the soft glow of the light above their door. The bonsai tree he had tended for years stood between them, its branches carefully shaped, a symbol of patience and resilience. She leaned her head against his arm. "I still feel it sometimes, that knot in my stomach, like it could happen again." Chuck sipped his tea, his voice steady. "That doesn't make you weak. It means you didn't lose your humanity in the fight." She exhaled softly, her lips curving in a faint smile. "But I also feel stronger. Not harder, but solid." He looked out at the quiet street. That's what courage leaves behind. Not noise, not victory dances, just steadiness. The porch fell silent again, but it was not empty silence. It was full of what they had endured, full of what they had reclaimed, full of the bond that humiliation had not broken, but had reforged in fire. For the first time since that day, The night felt peaceful. The story had become larger than either of them could have imagined. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Santa Clarita was no longer just a quiet suburban community. It was a name flashing across headlines, a hashtag climbing to the top of social media, a battlefield of words and images that spread faster than anyone could contain. Lily's face was everywhere, frozen in still frames of shock and fear. Chuck's fists in calm stance stood side by side in news reports, portrayed either as the hands of a protector or the blows of a dangerous man. Inside the Norris household, the television was muted, but the scrolling captions told the story anyway. Pundits debated whether Chuck had been justified, whether a father's instinct outweighed the sanctity of a badge. Some hosts defended him, their voices heavy with outrage at the officer's actions. Others sneered, accusing him of staging the entire scene to stay relevant, insisting that the world was seeing only what the cameras wanted them to see. Lily sat with her knees pulled to her chest on the living room sofa, her phone buzzing every few seconds with messages from classmates, strangers, journalists, all demanding her voice. "They make it sound like I provoked them," she whispered, her voice raw. "Like I wanted it." Chuck lowered the remote, his eyes fixed on her. "They twist truth because they're afraid of it. Don't let their noise tell you who you are." But the noise was relentless. Outside their home, clusters of people had gathered again, some with candles, others with cameras. Reporters hovered near the curb, microphones ready, waiting for a word, a look, anything they could sell. Among the supporters chanting for justice were others, more hostile, their voices rising in accusations. A group of men held printed signs accusing Chuck of brutality, waving them high for the cameras to catch. "Cop assaulter," one shouted. "Washed up thug," yelled another. It wasn't just solidarity anymore. It was division, fierce and unyielding. The Santa Clarita Police Department had been forced into a corner. Officers Hawk and Denton had been suspended, but the department's leadership was scrambling to protect its reputation. Anonymous statements leaked to the press painted Chuck as unstable, dangerous, a man with a history of aggression. Old tabloid stories about bar fights and exaggerated Hollywood myths resurfaced, twisted into weapons. The institution was flexing its muscles, unwilling to let two disgraced officers become symbols of systemic rot. Captain Mooney summoned Chuck and Lily to the station once more. The air inside was heavier this time, as though the walls themselves strained under the weight of scrutiny. Mooney looked tired, older than he had days before. His desk was covered in stacks of reports, subpoenas, and printed headlines. "I need you both to understand," he began, his voice steady but low. "You're not fighting just two officers anymore. You're fighting a machine. They're rallying unions, legal teams, and media backers. They want to paint you as the aggressors. They want to flip this." Lily's hands tightened on the edge of her chair. "They touched me, in front of everyone, on camera. How do you flip that?" Mooney sighed, rubbing his temple. "They'll say the footage is incomplete. They'll say it was staged. They'll dig into your father's past, into yours. They'll turn you from victim into villain if they can. That's what the system does when it feels threatened." Chuck leaned forward, his voice calm but ironbound. "Then we don't flinch. We don't run. The truth doesn't need noise. It needs persistence." Mooney studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You may be right, but persistence is costly." When they left the station, the parking lot outside had transformed into a swarm of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted over one another, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Norris, did you assault officers? Was your daughter harassed, or is this all a fabrication? Do you plan to press charges?" Chuck guided Lily through the chaos, ignoring every question, his silence speaking louder than any words. Yet he knew silence alone would not win this war. At home that night, Ernesto returned with more findings. Emails pulled from KH Security confirmed what Chuck had already suspected. The private firm had been contracted quietly through a network of local union backers who wanted the scandal buried. They had sent the drone, had surveilled his family, and had been prepared to release doctored footage to discredit them further. Ernesto laid the papers on the table like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to the system itself. "They're desperate," Ernesto said. "They know if this story holds, it spreads. And if it spreads, it exposes more than two bad cops. Lily stared at the documents, her chest tight. They're willing to stalk me, to break into my life just to make me shut up. Chuck placed a hand gently on hers. They want to make you small, but you're not. You're bigger than their shadows now. The next evening, protesters filled the streets outside the police department. Some carried signs in support of Lily, demanding accountability. Others defended the officers, shouting about respect for law and order. The plaza of the station became a battlefield of chants, two waves colliding without touching. News crews filmed from every angle, broadcasting the chaos nationwide. Inside, Mooney watched from the window, his jaw clenched. "We're not going to contain this," he muttered. "This isn't just about Santa Clarita anymore." Back at the Norris home, Lily scrolled through endless streams of commentary. For every voice calling her brave, another called her a liar. For every supporter demanding justice, another mocked her as an attention seeker. She dropped the phone on the table, tears stinging her eyes. Why do they hate me for telling the truth? Chuck sat across from her, his gaze steady. Because truth forces people to choose. And some are too afraid to leave the shadows they know. She wiped her face, her breath trembling. Then what do we do? He leaned back in his chair, his voice quiet but firm. We keep standing. The storm is bigger than us now, but so is the light. That night, as the chants outside grew louder, as helicopters hovered overhead filming the demonstrations, Chuck and Lily sat side by side, their home illuminated by flickering candles placed on their porch by strangers who refused to be silent. The city was tearing itself open around them, but inside the house there was a bond no system, no smear campaign, no shadow operation could break. Father and daughter scarred but unbroken, waiting for the next wave together. And somewhere in the quiet beyond the noise, the system recalculated its next move, unwilling to surrender. The battle between society and power had only just begun, and they were standing at its center. The protests continued into the following week, swelling in numbers as people from outside Santa Clarita traveled to join. Some carried candles and signs, others bullhorns and anger. The city that once knew only the quiet rhythm of suburban life now pulsed with the energy of conflict, its streets alive with competing voices. News vans parked on every corner, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, feeding the narrative to a nation divided. For Lily, each chant outside her window was both a comfort and a weight, proof that she was no longer alone, but also a reminder that her life had been pulled from her hands and placed beneath a microscope of millions. Chuck watched it all with the stillness of a man who had weathered storms before, yet even he knew this was unlike anything he had faced. This was not a fight of fists and holds, not a battle in a dojo or a staged clash on a movie set. This was a war of perception, of truth versus distortion, where every word in silence could tilt the balance. He said little to the cameras, letting the videos and witnesses speak for themselves. But the machine arrayed against them did not rest. Old colleagues were trotted out on television to question his temperament. Anonymous sources leaked stories painting him as violent and unhinged. Talk shows debated his worth, his daughter's credibility, the very humanity of their ordeal. Lily found herself at the center of it. She could not walk to the store without flashes blinding her, microphones shoved toward her, voices shouting her name. She kept her head down, her journal tucked into her bag, the pages inside filled with every word she had been too afraid to say aloud. Each time she heard her father's voice telling her to breathe, to stand, to remember that strength is not noise but steadiness. But at night, in the quiet of her room, she still felt the ghost of Hawk's hand, the sneer in Denton's laughter. Shame and rage mixed in her chest like coals that would not cool. The turning point came when Ernesto delivered the final pieces of evidence. He laid them out on Chuck's kitchen table, decrypted communications from KH Security, testimony from employees who had chosen to cooperate rather than sync with the company. The orders were clear, written in black and white. Gather compromising material on Chuck Norris and his daughter. Use surveillance, record interactions, release edited clips to discredit them. Do not engage physically. The drone had been part of a larger plan, one that failed not because it was weak, but because it underestimated the resolve of its target. This, Ernesto said, tapping the stack of papers, is enough to bring them down. Federal law will bury KH, and with them, the people who tried to make you the villains. Lily stared at the documents, her eyes scanning every damning sentence. So it wasn't just about me, she murmured. They were trying to protect the system, to make sure no one would believe anyone like me again. Samine, Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder, and now the system exposed itself, because of you. The raid on KH's offices was broadcast live. Cameras captured agents carrying boxes of hard drives, seizing computers, escorting employees out in handcuffs. The once smug Mark Albertson had fled days before, his absence only fueling the spectacle, but it no longer mattered. The evidence was overwhelming. Politicians who had remained silent began to speak. Advocacy groups seized the moment, calling for reforms, for oversight, for an end to the culture that allowed men like Hawke and Denton to thrive unchecked. For Lily, the change was not in headlines, but in the faces she met. When she returned to the plaza where it all began, she sat once more on the fountain's edge, her back straight, her eyes steady. The air smelled of coffee and warm pavement, just as it had that afternoon. But she was different. A woman approached, cautious but determined, and asked quietly, "Are you Lily?" When Lily nodded, the woman smiled with a trembling kind of gratitude. "My daughter was hurt by a cop last year. She never told me until now. After your story, she finally spoke. We filed a report. She said she wasn't afraid anymore." Lily's throat tightened, her eyes filling despite her best efforts. The woman squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry for what you went through, but because of you, she has a chance at justice." For the first time, Lily understood the true scale of what had happened. Her humiliation had not ended with her. It had echoed outward, breaking the silence of others, giving them the courage she had never intended to represent, but now could not deny. It was a legacy born of pain, but one that carried hope. At home that night, the porch light glowed softly above Chuck and Lily as they sat side by side. The bonsai tree, tended for years with patient hands, stood between them on the small table. Lily tucked her knees to her chest beneath a blanket, her head resting lightly against her father's arm. She spoke in a quiet voice, almost as if to herself. "I still feel it sometimes, that knot in my stomach, like it could happen again." Chuck sipped his tea slowly, his gaze fixed on the quiet street. "That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you didn't lose your humanity in the fight." She breathed out, a faint smile touching her lips. "But I also feel stronger now, like something inside me hardened, not in a bad way, just solid." He nodded. "That's what courage leaves behind. Not celebration, not noise, just steadiness." The night stretched around them, peaceful for the first time in many days. No drones buzzed above the trees. No voices chanted outside their gate. The world was still, but not empty. It was full of what they had endured, of the people they had inspired, of the bond that had carried them through fire and shadow. Later in her room, Lily opened her journal. On a clean page, she wrote one word in bold letters: closure. Beneath it, she listed each chapter of their ordeal in a single word: assault, response, exposure, threat, truth, accountability. She closed the book gently, her hand lingering on the cover before turning off the lamp and lying back in the dark. Downstairs, Chuck stood alone for a moment, his silhouette framed by the doorway as he looked out at the quiet street. The house had been shaken, but not broken. It stood not because of locks or alarms, but because what needed to be protected had been reclaimed. Not just his daughter's safety, but her voice. He switched off the porch light, exhaled deeply, and walked inside. Behind him, the night remained still. For the first time since the shadows had fallen over them, that silence meant not fear, but peace. And though the storm outside was far from over for the world, for father and daughter it had passed. What lingered was not the wound, but the legacy of standing unbroken, and the knowledge that sometimes when truth is defended with steadiness, it does not fade. It multiplies. This was just one story, but there are many more waiting for you. Don't miss what comes next. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you're first to see every new video. Check out the other stories on this channel for even more shocking twists, and if this one hit you hard, share it with your friends. Let them feel it too.